This section opens the whole book on a single move. A model earns its truth by what it omits. Arbib begins from the old dictum that the map is not the territory, and that one territory sustains many maps, each cut to its own task, the way a motorist's chart and a hiker's chart diverge over the same land. This is the generative primitive for everything downstream. To explain the path from neuron to cognition, you never seek the complete simulation. You seek the simplest sufficient map for the question you actually hold. The recursion is where the elegance lives. The brain is itself built of maps, retinotopic, somatotopic, tonotopic. The book's computational models are maps of those maps. And this opening perspective is a map of the book. Choose the omission first, and understanding follows. This section explains why a model of the brain is a chosen loss and what that choice buys you. A model is a lossy projection chosen for a task, and its usefulness is exactly what it discards. Arbib's opening reframes computational neuroscience as map-making. One territory, the brain, licenses many maps, each built for a different question, none of them complete. The detailed all-biochemistry model obscures rather than illuminates even. You ascend from neurons toward cognition, not by simulating every molecule, but by isolating a fundamental problem, finding the simplest model that charts it, then hunting for shared brain operating principles across models. The governing hypothesis is that mind is brains and bodies in interaction, structured by the action-perception cycle, resting on learning and memory. The boundary the chapter marks is this: model apart in isolation, and you may go blind to brain, body, and environment dynamics. This section explains what a neuron model actually is. A neuron model is a choice of what to discard. Chapter 2 by Brunel hands the book its instrument set, a ladder running from the McCulloch-Pitts binary threshold through the leaky integrator firing rate cell down to Hodgkin-Huxley's ion channel, biophysics and its many compartment refinements. The generative move is to read the ladder as ordered by resolution, then take the coarsest description that still reproduces the phenomenon you care about. That reading is the primitive, and the four models are only its rungs. Everything downstream inherits this one decision. That is the whole primitive. A model is its deliberate subtraction, and fidelity is the least subtraction that survives the question being asked. This section explains why neural modeling begins by trading mechanism for statistics and how that single move stacks into a ladder of abstractions. Neural activity refuses a deterministic description. Identical stimuli yield different spike trains on every trial. So the chapter's founding move is to trade mechanism for the statistics that are sufficient at the next level. Up. Watch the ladder climb. A spike train becomes a point process, the Poisson atom. Its irregularity collapses to a single number, the firing rate. That rate becomes a variable a population model manipulates, and populations in turn become the units of a network. Each rung discards the biophysics of the rung below and keeps only what the rung above needs in order to predict. Brunel's primer is really one ladder. Modeling is choosing the coarsest abstraction that still carries the signal upward. Predict any level from that, and you have the whole toolkit, nested compression. This section recasts the neuron as a trajectory rather than a device that computes. A neuron becomes a trajectory. Its meaning is where its internal state flows over time, rather than what it wires to. That is the whole move of the chapter, in Chapter 3 by Rubin and Rinzel. recast the biology as a flow in state space, and one vocabulary subsumes the whole zoo of models. Equilibrium, stability, and oscillation become the primitives. A memory is an attractor. The dynamics roll into the low point of the hot field energy. A decision is which basin captures you. A rhythm is a limit cycle. From here, every network the book builds, winner. Take all, dynamic field, integrate and fire reads as one thing, a state, and where it goes next. This section explains why a neuron is best understood as a trajectory in phase space rather than as a train of spikes. A neuron is a trajectory in phase space. Write its state as an ordinary differential equation, and the behavior you care about becomes the geometry the solutions live on. You never solve the equation. You read where the trajectories are pulled. A stable critical point is rest. A closed orbit is repetitive spiking. Excitability is a stable point guarding a threshold. The generative move is this. Qualitative structure, not the integrated solution, classifies dynamical states and predicts their transitions. Vary a parameter, watch a fixed point lose stability, and you have named a transition type, a bifurcation, without tracking a single action potential. The phase portrait is the neuron. Everything downstream reads off its invariance. This section explains how the 4 neural rhythms arise from a single mechanism. An inhibitory pulse that periodically silences a population sets a clock. The interval between silences is the frequency, and the band names delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma are just the time scale of that inhibition. Slow sleep waves up through fast attention. Here is the generative surprise. The same inhibition that fixes the period also synchronizes the cells caught inside it. A locomotor pattern, generator phase, locks every neuron rigidly to drive a leg. Cortex behaves otherwise. Here, cells must fire differentially within each cycle to carry information. The rhythm is only the population envelope. The message lives in how individual firing departs from it. Whether that envelope organizes cognition or merely echoes, it stays open. This section explains why a brain rhythm is a behavior to regenerate rather than an object to catalog. The whole method of the chapter is to build the smallest network whose dynamics reproduce the measured oscillation, then read the mechanism off the model rather than off the recording. The primitive the rest depends on is reciprocal coupling between an excitatory population and an inhibitory one, where inhibition decays more slowly than re-excitation takes. That arrangement is itself an oscillator. Frequency falls out of the synaptic time constants, not out of any clock. The canonical instance is ping, pyramidal interneuron gamma. Everything scales from that one move. The same delayed negative feedback gives fast local gamma among cortical cells and, stretched across thalamus and cortex, the slow sensory motor mu rhythm. This section explains how the brain operation database links a model to the data that tests it. A model earns nothing by running. It earns by registering against data, and that registration is itself an object you can store and search. The move BooDB makes is to split the empirical claim from the model. A summary of empirical data belongs to no model, one model, or many. A summary of simulation results belongs to exactly one. Validation is the join between them. Does this SSR explain or contradict that SED? Orthogonal to the structural axis, which brain regions a model touches, runs a functional axis, the brain operating principles. A model instantiates, winner take all, Hebbian learning. So models sharing neither anatomy nor task still compare in principle. the database reifies the link that journal prose leaves implicit. This section explains what actually carries a model's scientific content and how a database called BODB captures it. A model's scientific content lives in its bindings to evidence, which data constrained its design, which data tested its performance, and what it predicts. The code is not the science. The code is not the science. BottleDB reifies exactly those edges, where an older database, ModelDB, stores only the artifact. The move here splits a model's identity into two ontologies. The first is a structural ontology, the brain regions the model spans. The second is a functional ontology made of brain operating principles, or BOPs. Patterns like winner take all that stay reusable across regions and tasks. 4 entities populate this scheme: models, BOPs, empirical summaries called SEDs, and simulation summaries called SSRs. The science lives in the graph joining them, rather than in the nodes themselves. Reify the binding, and meta-analysis collapses to search. Find every model this dataset contradicts. This section explains Hebbian learning at its most primitive level. Correlation is the only thing a synapse can see. Hebb's rule makes that the whole learning signal. A weight grows when its 2 neurons fire together and does nothing otherwise, so each junction becomes a local correlation detector. There is no teacher, no error signal, no view beyond its own 2 endpoints. From that single primitive, the chapter builds everything. A network stores the statistics of its own experience, self-organizing, because every synapse independently records how often presynaptic cause coincided with postsynaptic effect. The catch is the step the rest of the chapter has to repair. Pure coincidence. Counting only ever adds, so weights run away unbounded. And that is exactly the instability the chapter's later mechanisms exist to tame. Learning here is what a population of purely local rules does when correlations flow through it. This section explains where memory actually lives. Memory lives not in neurons, but in the correlations between them. A synapse is a local coincidence detector. It may read only what physically reaches it, the presynaptic spike arriving and the postsynaptic cell's own state. It strengthens precisely when those two are jointly active. That is the whole of Hebb, fire together, wire together, stated as a locality constraint plus a sensitivity to correlation. The chapter's move is to make this postulate mathematical. Everything downstream then falls out of one rule iterated, a banana cell assembly, associative recall from a partial cue, cortex reallocating itself toward frequent stimuli. Learning becomes the fixed point of local correlation. Reading. This section explains how neuromodulation lets one fixed neural circuit run many different computations. Excitation and inhibition describe a circuit whose function is fixed by its wiring. The same synapses, the same currents, always the same computation. Neuromodulation breaks that assumption. A diffuse chemical, dopamine or acetylcholine, retunes the components themselves. It shifts channel conductances, firing thresholds, and whether a neuron bursts or fires in a steady tonic mode. So one fixed anatomy runs many programs without rewiring a single connection. The stomatogastric ganglion is the clean anchor. It is a handful of neurons that generate entirely different motor rhythms as the modulatory bar around them changes. The chapter's move is this. Computation lives not only in the connection graph, but in the tunable state of its nodes. That is a parameter layer. The excitation and inhibition picture leaves out. This section explains why the standard 2-word grammar of neural computation is too poor. and what a third channel adds. The dominant grammar of neural computation is two words: excitation and inhibition. The chapter's thesis is that this grammar is too poor. A fixed anatomical circuit can implement many computations, and what selects among them is a third channel: neuromodulation. Dopamine, acetylcholine, and their kin do not add a signal on top. They retune the conductances that decide how a neuron integrates everything else: bursting versus tonic, firing, which synapses count, how the dendrites sum their inputs. The wiring is the instrument. The stomatogastric ganglion is the anchor that carries the argument. One small circuit, several rhythms switched by chemistry, while the wiring itself never changes. Read this as the reconfiguration layer that the excitation and inhibition picture structurally omits. This section explains how the nervous system produces coordinated movement. Picture a decerebrated cat on a treadmill. Give it only a stronger jolt to one spot in the brainstem, and it walks, then trots, then gallops. The coordinated rhythm already sits in the spinal cord, not in the brain. That is the move the whole chapter turns on. Motor control is factored. The pattern lives in a self-oscillating local circuit called the central pattern generator, running open loop. An isolated spinal cord with no body and no sensory feedback still produces full fictive swimming. So the descending command is merely low-dimensional. A single scalar for speed or for gait selects and paces a primitive the cord already owns. Add the feedback and the modulation around that core, and you get the motor pattern generator. Movement is a compiled vocabulary. The cord stores the primitive, and the brain calls it, rather than choreographing each moment by hand. This section explains where the pattern of a coordinated movement is actually generated. Coordinated movement is stored below, in the spinal cord, rather than computed from above by the brain. Cut the spinal cord free of the brain, and it still produces fictive locomotion, the full alternating rhythm of a walk, with no commander and no sensory feedback. The chapter's primitive is that motor control is a vocabulary problem. The spinal cord and brainstem hold central pattern generators, small oscillatory circuits, roughly 1 per degree of freedom, that emit whole coordinated patterns open loop. Descending drive selects and modulates sensory feedback tunes, but the pattern is generated locally. The brain addresses movements, it does not dictate muscles, and the periphery even feeds back onto the very centers meant to command it. This section explains the chapter's central move, motor control, stated as a control problem before any brain structure enters. Feedback alone cannot steer a limb. The sensory signal arrives already stale, delayed behind the movement it reports. The chapter's answer is to replace the body, the plant, with a model of it. The controller keeps 2 models. A forward model predicts what a command will do. An inverse model takes a desired result and computes the command that produces it. The plant is simulated in both directions. Now action runs ahead of its own delay. Slow feedback only corrects the residual and trains the models. That is the chapter's place in the book's arc. Motor control is stated as control theory rather than brain anatomy, the general computational problem, named before any structure that implements it. This section frames reaching as a control problem. Reaching is a control problem. The limb is a plant, a nonlinear dynamical system, and the brain is its controller, steering state toward a target against the 4 obstacles any engineer faces: nonlinearity, redundancy, delay, and noise. That single import is the chapter's whole move. motor neuroscience becomes control theory, and the brain's tricks resolve into recognizable engineering ones. Feedback corrects from measured error, but chokes on delay. Feed forward commands ahead of the senses, but needs a model of the body it drives. The nervous system blends both. Predict the next case from this. Wherever biology must act faster than its own senses can report, expect an internal model standing in for the missing measurement. This section explains reinforcement learning as a structural primitive. No teacher tells the animal the right move. Only a critic returns reward, deferred and tangled up with later choices. The generative trick is this. Do not wait for reward, predict it, then learn from the gap between successive predictions. Each estimate of future reward is bootstrapped against the next one after fresh evidence lands. That discrepancy, the temporal difference error, is the entire learning signal. Reward never teaches directly, only surprise about reward does. This is what Chapter 10 is for in the book's arc. It turns learn to predict biologically important events into learn to act, and it gives the abstract machinery a body. The midbrain dopamine burst carries exactly that prediction error. This section explains how learning to act well collapses onto a single number, the gap between reward received and reward predicted. This chapter is the book's argument that control reduces to prediction. You never need a teacher naming the correct move, only the running surprise, delta, which equals the reward received minus the reward predicted. That one quantity nudges every expectation incrementally toward what actually happened. The turn is that this scalar is more than a modeling convenience. Midbrain dopamine neurons broadcast exactly it. So one error term closes 2 stories at once, the psychologist's century-old conditioning curve and the physiologist's puzzle of what dopamine is for. Prediction error becomes the shared substrate of the behaving mind and the firing midbrain. This section collapses 3 kinds of memory into one axis. 3 psychological boxes, short-term, long-term, and working, collapse into a single axis, the timescale of the dynamical variable that holds the trace. Long-term memory is a slow synaptic variable that consolidation later migrates into the slow ones. Labile relaxes into a hot field energy minimum with a hard capacity ceiling. Working memory is self-sustained firing, a persistent activity attractor kept alive for seconds, orders of magnitude past any neuron's time, constant of tens of milliseconds. Short-term memory. That is the chapter's work in the book. It translates the folk taxonomy of Atkinson and Schifrin into the dynamical systems language of Chapter 3, so that memory kind becomes variable time scale and nothing more. This section explains what sets the capacity of memory. A stored memory is a signal competing against noise, and the noise is every other memory written after it. That single reframing generates the whole chapter. Capacity is the moment a trace sinks below the interference of everything stored since. The sheer amount that fits is not the constraint. With unbounded synapses, the signal holds while the noise grows only as the square root of p. Memory drowns only when p reaches the order of the number of synapses, a huge number. Impose the realistic constraint that synapses have only a few stable states and the trade inverts. Noise flattens and the signal now decays exponentially. Recent memories survive and old ones fade to make room. Every mechanism the chapter builds is a device to postpone that crossing. The bistability of CAM kinase A2, fast to slow consolidation and sparse codes.